Sponged is a mythical sea monster who supposedly rules the oceans. The folklore goes that he lures small children into throwing themselves in the ocean to meet him, whereupon they're never seen again. One could compare this with the real-world Scottish myth of the Kelpie, a monstrous equine creature with green, seaweed-like hair, who tricks people into following it on false pretenses, luring them into a trap before submerging them in an abyss, and brutally murdering and devouring them. Folklore is so silly, isn't it? They had such overactive imaginations back in ancient times. The current leader of the Bestian concerebral party, Margaret Sampson Jr., is quite notorious, arguing that her predecessor, Margaret Sampson Jr., had triangulated whatever that means on the points of the bloodthirsty Arvich Empire and the revolutionary spirit that all true concerebrals should act with. Margaret boldly adopts political stances that many regard as extreme even by the concerebral standards. Her policies include the introduction of a zero-day work week, the introduction of Marxist ideology to Bestia, and the systematic genocide of the entire Bestian upper class under the blade of a rational, logical, scientifically engineered execution device she affectionately refers to as Mistress Twinklesheen. It's been put to Baroness Lady Dame Margaret that she, along with her entire extended family, which bleeds into other families, like the Gownspears and Lambdons, and her expansive friendship circle belong to the very same upper class that she calls to be genocided, to which she has responded that they don't count because they're not like all those other aristocrats for reasons she has yet to explain at all. The famously Bourguignon and socialist Margaret has been accused of hypocrisy in her politics, such as with her position that paid-for private magules are an elitist blight on the Bestian landscape, that maintain the hateful class divide and need to be abolished, and that anyone sending their child to such an institution is morally corrupt. She stands by this position in spite of the fact it's been confirmed that Margaret sends all of her own children to Heaton, the most expensive and prestigious magule in the whole of Bestia, and that for that matter Margaret's entire family have always gone to the same magule, and continue to do so to this day. Margaret explained that she just wants what's best for her children, and her brother's children, and her stepsister's children, and everyone else in her extended family's children, as any good mother and sister and stepsister and distant relative would, which some take to be a wafer thin attempt at heartstring tugging that she's doing to try and weasel out of her blatant political hypocrisy. The magules themselves also take great issue with Margaret's complaints, none more so than their predominantly Walfian faculty, who insist that they just want to provide the best introduction to the real world available to our nation's children. Some more controversial incidents include the time when Margaret photographed a Bestian house lavished with Bestian flags, blew the photo up to an enormous size, and bolted it onto the side of the old house of Mower, with all the flags scribbled over with the message "Filthy nationalist humans come sucking gammon." The owner of the house later protested that he was just a flag sales goat advertising his wares and was now living penniless on the street after his flags had all been vandalized by concerebral agitators who later returned to firebomb his home to the ground. Perhaps most sinister of all, rumors have begun circulating that Margaret is secretly a rampant anti-left-hander, harboring a deep-seated bigotry against the left-handed that she has been accused of actively enabling and even encouraging within her own party. Margaret denies these allegations, although a growing proportion of the general public are coming to put stock in the idea, citing things like the verified photographs of Margaret openly urinating on the Sini staff, a giant stone monument erected in memorial of all the victims of the sinistral genocide that followed the Wars of the Hands. Many citizens aren't convinced by Margaret's insistence she just really needed to go to the toilet, and there wasn't anywhere else to do it. Similar concerns have been expressed about other photographs of Margaret smiling and shaking hands with the Dextrux clan, a well-known white supremacist terrorist group responsible for all manner of atrocities against left-handers. The matter has also been raised of the speech she made at this Dextrux clan event, secretly recorded without her knowledge, in which she stated, "We have to stamp those filthy, parasitic leftists out for good like the vermin they are, and finish the job Demarek didn't have the guts to the first time." Margaret has shut down the suggestion that these incidents reveal any kind of prejudice against left-handers on her part by saying, "Let's not talk about the past, let's talk about the present." In what the concerebrals have called a stubborn intransigence in the face of this sterling line of reasoning, many Bestians still want to talk about the past. Many anecdotal accounts have started to come forth of concerebrals espousing opinions on the Sinister Seven being real, and questioning the official account of the Sinistral genocide. Meat King, which is the latest rebranded name for the fast food company run by Ronald Crocknold, has recently undergone a series of mass layoffs in response to some public questions being raised about the lack of transparency on various points regarding the sources of his meat, as well as the rumors of inappropriate conduct on the part of their Walfian mascot, the Meat King himself. Crocknold has assured consumers that with these layoffs complete, they can have confidence in his establishment. It's been questioned as to how laying off steamed ham flippers and Massey addresses the concerns raised, but Crocknold assures that the wheat has been separated from the chaff, and there are no longer grounds for concern. In reality, this sort of approach to corporate issues is standard practice. For example, buy things from our company corporation, CRTM, have undergone several hundred mass layoffs in the last decade, each of which was conducted in response to profit shortfalls and hits to the company's reputation that had no obvious connection to the work of those employees being laid off. Some commentators have opined that mass layoffs like these are a mindless Puerto Rico tactic used by corrupt executives to fraudulently shift the blame away from themselves in the aftermath of problems that they are fully responsible for causing, both to falsely incriminate the expendable workforce and to falsely create the appearance that such problems have now been solved. These commentators also opine that there is a similar motivation behind standard practices, like changing the company's name or donating money to charity in the aftermath of reputational damage, and that the laziness of such methods demonstrates the complete unwillingness or the inability of the executives to effectively resolve the actual underlying problems that led to the reputational damage in the first place, instead preferring to just try and make the bad reputation go away through offensively crude psychological manipulation techniques rather than by doing the kinds of things that would actually make them deserve not to have the bad reputation they are clearly trying to shake off. In a turn of events that has stunned all parties concerned, the company's biochemical research department have discovered that these views are a product of the mind virus believed to be currently sweeping across the whole world at a rapid rate. One of media mogul Rupert Beardoxwell's most well-known political positions is that Arvichian citizens of Far West extraction should be banned from wearing the face masks that became a popular item of clothing in the Far West following the historical outbreak of a virus they call the White Death. He insists that his view is rationally justified, as the face masks, which cover one's entire face save for the eyes, are repressive, and therefore incompatible with Arvichian core values like freedom and liberty. The counter-argument that forcibly banning people from wearing an item of clothing that they wish to wear of their own free will is pretty repressive in itself has been met with the logical point that the masks are so ingrained in Far West culture that they feel pressured to wear the things, and that therefore their free will is an illusion. A follow-up counter to this has been raised that banning it on such grounds sounds like something that in other contexts Beardoxwell and his Arvichian news would condemn as nanny knows best intrusions upon citizens' liberties being presumptuously invoked by the state for their own good. In response to this, Beardoxwell has turned to what he terms the logically motivated position that the masks aren't compatible with deeply rooted Arvichian cultural norms, which was met with the counterpoint that a legal mandate on all citizens to be bound to the supposed cultural norms of everyone being able to see one's face would be a far worse kind of tradition-bound repression than what he claims the masks themselves to be. Beardoxwell has followed up to this with the rationally grounded and critically thought-out argument that the ability to see someone's entire face and not just the eyes is important for non-verbal communication, and that without this civil society would collapse into misunderstanding and confusion. This has been met with the observations that the eyes are themselves the source of most non-verbal expression across all species, that the Arvichian fashion of sunglasses that completely obscure the eyes has gone completely without objection by Beardoxwell and his publication, and that in any case there is no evidentiary basis to the notion that any such collapse will ever take place off the back of not being able to see the faces of a very small minority of the Arvichian population, which those of far western ancestry comprise. Currently, Beardoxwell has yet to respond to these latest points, but still insists he is motivated in his campaign purely by logic and reason. Some commentators, however, wonder if Beardoxwell's position could be motivated by something else entirely, something that in bygone eras he, and others like him, would have been able to openly admit to, but in modern times have to conceal behind respectable veneers, like logic and rationality, in order to prevent people from seeing it for what it really is. Such commentators have been identified by things from our company corporation, CRTMS research scientists, to be in the grip of the mind virus, a position that the Arvichian news has recently started another campaign to endorse. Some of those same commentators have quipped that perhaps wearing the far western face masks would help in curbing the spread of this mind virus, but this suggestion has been met with an incendiary reaction from the publication, which says that would be an incredibly stupid thing to do and that it would be far more rational to actively spread the virus as much as possible through state-mandated interpersonal contact instead. A contention has been raised that this would seem to go against the quarantining campaign currently spearheaded by the Arvichian News, on the back of the Mind Virus Act, which the paper has previously argued is the only rational response to the mind virus. This contention has been diagnosed as a product of the mind virus, but the Arvichian News does not endorse the quarantining of those affected in this instance. Instead, it advocates for them to be executed along with everybody living within a 3-mile radius of their home. It should also be noted that controversial professors Doc Bleetlam and Kinder Surmise have come out in solidarity with Beardoxwell's face mask position, despite emphatically trying to distance themselves from him and his wider politics. The pair of highly influential academics argue that the Far West and its culture are hotbeds of what they call the forces of unreason needing to be corrected via the building of an empire of reason. Surmise argues for violent subjugation, while Bleetlam insists on peaceful measures being used to achieve the same imperious end result. Bleetlam has specifically asserted that those who don't agree with his view on face masks are cowards, and he also insists his face mask stance is in no way motivated by the fact wolves are particularly susceptible to breath-borne illnesses. There is a strong cultural attachment in Arvich to devices engineered purely to cause as much destruction as physically possible to the environment. Following the invention of an explosive device called TMT, about 150 years ago, large cross-sections of the Arvichian mainland were set about with the substance in order to destroy obstacles, like hills, mountains, and rock, so as to settle the land for human habitation. It's now recognized that this was often done at the expense of eon residents, such as mountain Gaetians and other terrain-sensitive peoples, to such an extent that some now feel this persecution might have been a major motivator for the destruction in itself. In any case, due to this history, Arvich invests a lot of meaning in not only TMT, but any kind of device for causing as much destruction as possible. Scientists and engineers are constantly trying to innovate new ways to destroy people and things as thoroughly as possible. As such, there have been suggestions in recent years that there might be something unhealthy on some level about Arvich's intense reverence for things designed explicitly and unambiguously to destroy everything they come into contact with. Some bold commentators even hint at the idea that ease of access to such devices should be restricted. Currently, it's notoriously easy for literally anybody to get their hands on TMT, demonite, and a recent obscure invention known as Democratian particle splitters, which scientists excitedly say may have future destructive potential. However, these kinds of suggestions have been met with complete disapproval from the Arvichian establishment, including academics, politicians, and various other interest groups. Their argument is that there is no good reason to believe that there is anything dangerous about mass destruction devices being easily accessible to pretty much everybody, nor is there anything dangerous about the cultural fixation the country has with the things. Most citizens have confirmed in opinion polls that these arguments cleared up everything for them, although some still take issue with the authorities' stated positions. For one thing, they cite the notorious bombing campaigns from over 10 years ago by disaffected left-handed youths, wherein each such youth set off a 20-meter blast in built-up areas, causing severe damage to all properties in the flashpoint and killing at least 2 citizens in each instance. Following the left-handed genocide, such bombing campaigns have only continued to pick up with other disaffected groups including Rodantians, Bestian apologists, and plant/fungusians, increasing in frequency and severity, to the point that several such incidents now happen every single day throughout the Arvich mainland. It seems to such commentators that all evidence indicates the trends can be expected to worsen and spread to other social groups, unless something restrictive is done to curb it. On this note, they point to the apparent failure of the government's approach of actively encouraging as many people to carry explosives as possible so that they can use the explosives to blow up the people trying to blow people up with explosives. The government rejects this failure characterization, arguing that their attempted solution made far more sense than any kind of explosive restriction ever could. More significantly to these commentators, though, is the point that the Arvichian establishment's stance on explosives seems inconsistent with their stances on other issues, like when political extremists started sneaking onto Arvichian colonial warships, hijacking and scuttling them to protest the imperial conquests they were embarking on. Without a moment's hesitation, Arvich proceeded to impose severe restrictions on citizens' access not only to warships, but to passenger ships, as well as imposing tight controls on the security process for shipboarding and what passengers can do while riding on the ships themselves. Similar behavior was exhibited in relation to border checkpoints, including the Bestian border, among other things that, to some, all seem very similar in nature to the explosive restriction proposals that the government categorically refuses to consider. There's also the matter of the aforementioned left-handed bombing campaigns, to which the government's official response was to declare war against and systematically genocide almost all left-handers in Arvichian jurisdiction. Before it was discovered left-handedness wasn't genetic, thus undermining the entire purpose of the genocide project. Given all this, some wonder if the various parties that inflexibly defend explosives against any and all concerns might possibly have a blind, mindless, tribal loyalty to the things that is utterly impervious to all sense and reason. One Merry Christmas decades ago, Lord Conrad, aka Lord Courtage, aka Scrooge McDuck, caved to public pressure and invited local spinster Tricia, aka Magic a Day Spell, round for Christmas. She rather predictably put the moves on him with a suggestive story she'd written about the two of them, but Conrad came prepared. Years later he hired her as a nanny to look after his son, Symbiosis, aka Ralph, which surprised the locals given his obvious contempt for the woman. Rumors even started circulating that Tricia was Ralph's real mother, but birth records made it clear this was not the case, as did her proven infertility. In the years leading up to Conrad's departure from Eones, aka Qualem, village, further rumors emerged that Conrad had fathered or adopted a second child, who some claimed to have heard laughing and playing from within his mansion's high-walled garden, and there were some especially salacious suspicions as to just who this child was. Yet another rumor cropped up in the year or so prior to Conrad's exit that he had secretly put this second child up at Tricia's run-down, ramshackle orphanage. None of these rumors were ever confirmed, and Conrad denied them with characteristic contempt every step of the way, but Tricia's subsequent inheritance of the old mansion after Conrad and his remaining family move out certainly added fuel to the gossip fire. Monkeys are often hard to tell apart from humans, since interbreeding is far more common between the two species than for any eons, to the point many people who appear human may in fact be hybrids, and vice versa. The term half-breed would be considered highly inappropriate to refer to such individuals, although it is in quite common use with reference to eon interbreeds, and especially to eons who have been interbred with humans or monkeys. With regard to interbreeding across sapient species in general, it's somewhat of a genetic lottery as to what traits are inherited by interbred children. Many successive generations of breeding out a species into a new one can lead to the descendants becoming almost indistinguishable from their new species, although evidence of their ancestry is always available on a genetic level, and will also manifest physically upon close enough scrutiny. Given the recent developments in genetics that render DNA-based species detection possible, motions are currently being passed in Arvich for mandatory DNA testing conducted in order to weed out half-breeds who might otherwise pass for or impersonate humans and monkeys. Bestia's Liberative Party are notorious for trying to push through similar motions on what they insist are logical and rational grounds, although they have so far been unsuccessful, likely owing to the general Bestian opposition to political actions perceived as persecutory to eons. To be more specific, the Liberatives' chief argument for the policy is that hybrids could potentially impersonate another species for insidious purposes, and so mandatory species identification would help prevent such developments. However, there is a broad impression that the Libvatives have ulterior motives for the policy, citing a historical and arguably ongoing tradition of actively opposing eones interests in society, often throwing them under the train in service of the wider political agendas, which coincidentally tend to favor humans and monkeys in pretty much every conceivable way, to the point that some commentators feel their logical and rational justifications for such political developments, as the mandatory DMA testing, are in fact nothing more than a shallow excuse to cover for their blatantly partisan political priorities. Comparisons have been drawn with the Arvichian Toilet Liberation Front, which was founded by controversial political agitator Professor Mary Sherry of Harvard Magul, which Bestians tend to perceive as having similarly sinister motivations behind the ostensibly rational basis on which they allege their anti-eon toilet reform campaigning to rest. Professor Sherry, now deceased, claimed to be concerned for toilet eons being abused by eons, citing scientific studies conducted by the Fake Human Extirpation Society, FHES, which demonstrated that incidents of toilet eons being abused by their eon users had been reported in no fewer than 10 anonymous anecdotal accounts throughout the Arvich Empire in 285 alone. Some commentators question why similar such studies had not been conducted with regard to non-eons abusing toilet eons, as well as what the nature of the alleged abuse was, or whether there was any non-anecdotal evidence that the reported abuse had ever even happened at all. Such commentators were dismissed by Sherry as anti-intellectual in nature, and she called for their removal from academic office, which led to the forcible dismantling of research bodies that had started conducting follow-on studies in order to try and answer these questions. Given these developments, some came to wonder if Professor Sherry was in fact weaponizing the FHES studies to push a pro-monkey agenda, actively antagonizing eons to do so. This suspicion was lent some credence in the eyes of some by the fact that the guerrilla Sherry had spent the preceding 2.5 decades campaigning vigorously for monkey rights against perceived encroachment from eons. In response to all the controversy that surrounded her at the time, Sherry conducted several public interviews, in which it was reported that her immediate response to literally every single point of objection was to laugh dismissively at the objector, and thereafter assert that their objection was unreasonable, and that she was being persecuted by the establishment for standing up for non-human rights. A younger Emperor Demaric, aka Premier Spons, supported her politically in her efforts, which almost certainly accounts for the Toilet Liberation Front's ultimate success in its campaigning efforts. Earlier campaigns of Sherry's on behalf of monkeykind include her opposition to eons being allowed to take jobs in place of equally qualified monkeys, that monkey-eon hybrids should not be conferred full monkey rights, which are identical to human rights, and that eon farming was fair for its day. Geoffrey Goatsucker is the world's most prominent philanthropist and a highly successful business ref. His success story got off the ground several decades ago when he invented and patented a smaller version of the steam engines that are used to power trains. The smaller steam engine, known as the mini-engine, had the advantage of being cheap to produce, which opened up doors for further train and steam power circulation. While this development was indeed a cornerstone in the proliferation and subsequent widespread adoption of steam technology, some have accused Goatsucker of exploiting this legacy, with his later business practices perceived as ruthless and insidious, even suggestive of a power complex within Goatsucker himself, who seemed determined to maintain his hold over the steam market at all costs long past the point that the novelty of his innovative steam engine design wore off. Furthermore, steam technology experts who have analyzed Goatsucker's designs and engineering works have come away with the conclusion that despite his image as a brilliant steam engineer, Goatsucker's abilities are actually quite subpar, his famous mini-engine being riddled with schoolboy design flaws that he subsequently used his enormous wealth and influence to exploit far superior engineers in order to cover up. Given such points of complaint, there is a common perception amongst fellow steam engineers and architects that Goatsucker's prominence on the world stage is largely a product of his self-aggrandizing, anti-competitive business tactics rather than the inherent value or worthiness of either himself or the mini-engine invention that brought him the prominence in the first place, or indeed of anything else his company has produced over the decades. It's been pointed out that since Goatsucker's steam engines are by far the most popular in the world, their designs are also the most exploitable, with sabotage being a reportedly common problem. This is compounded by their tendency to abruptly turn blue and cease to function without explanation until several tons of coal are shoveled into the relevant furnace. Reportedly, this phenomenon can strike at any time without warning, which has led to serious problems in the past. The popular complaints came to a head over a decade ago when Goatsucker's company announced their latest engine, the Steam Vantage. Built with safety in mind, in light of the perceived frailty and exploitability of previous engines, this one required coal shovelers to press a button on the side of the engine every time they shoveled a pile of coal into the furnace, to clarify that they had definitely intended to shovel the coal into the furnace. Many people felt this was a redundant and patronizing feature that provided little to nothing of value. Goatsucker retorted that the feature could be turned off, but the mechanism for doing so was reportedly so obscure as to be completely non-obvious, and in any case by the time word of this override got out, the damage had already been done. In spite of the engine's abysmal failure, it still sold many units, and Goatsucker's engine designs have continued to be preeminent to this very day, which critics argue is owed entirely to his aforementioned sinister business practices propping up what would otherwise be a floundering organization that has contributed little of significant value over and above its competitors following its innovation of the mini-engine 30-plus years ago. Some have gone further with their criticisms of Goatsucker's perceived thirst for power and influence, arguing that the same applies to his philanthropy work under his separate organization he set up for this purpose, the Giraffe Goatsucker Initiative by Giraffe Goatsucker, or GGI, GG for short. This organization takes funding from Goatsucker and a wide variety of anonymous financial sources, and spends it on whatever foreign aid work is to Goatsucker's own personal fancy. Some have suggested it's rather presumptuous and vain of the Arvichian Goatsucker to take such control over the redistribution of this wealth to the current and former impoverished Arvichian colonies that comprise its chief recipients. It's also been suggested that the residents of these colonies themselves should perhaps be solicited on what kind of support, if any, they'd like to receive from their imperial subjugator and its most preeminent figures. Goatsucker has insisted such concerns are misplaced, saying he knows what's best for the peoples he's philanthropizing and can be trusted to treat them fairly, as evidenced by his ability to invent a small steam engine and gatekeep it in the face of all those who might have otherwise benefited from it in his tyrannical, parasitic corporation's absence. Accusations of sexual harassment, which have been leveled at Goatsucker by natives of the regions he supports, are dismissed by him. In the world of the Mower show, Christmas is increasingly suspected to have been one of several religious traditions dating back to before the time of the unicorns, the others being Kwanzaa, Ramadan, and Hanukkah, the last of which is also suspected to have once been spelled differently. In the modern Eastern world, of course, the captaincy is far and away the dominant religion, with upwards of 95% of people placing some degree of faith in the captain and his manifest, although the captaincy institution itself is going through somewhat troubled times. It's noteworthy that this faith applies to regions that are not and never have been colonies of the Arvich Empire, suggesting that belief in the captain persisted worldwide throughout the age of the unicorns. The Far West, however, while also having a relatively high faith in the captain, with 55% of the population reporting belief in his existence, has a variety of alternative religious traditions that are more or less unheard of in the East. The most prominent of these is Buddhism, a similarly ancient belief system to the captaincy, dedicated to the idea that everything is completely and utterly meaningless, with life conceived as a miserable cage that the ideal Buddhist should strive to free their friends and family from, with the ultimate goal of removing everybody from existence entirely, so the whole world can enter a blissful afterlife known as nirvana. While Buddhism is deeply respected in the Far West, it's met with some degree of skepticism in the East, where people find the religion's deeply nihilistic nature to be unsettling. Even more unsettling, however, are the persistent rumors in both the Western and Eastern worlds that a subset of Buddhists have a very disturbing interpretation of how best to remove their loved ones from the meaningless world. These rumors are fueled by the notorious glut of mysterious disappearances that appears to plague the Far West, which has been compared with a similarly large body of people in the East who abruptly decide to take extended vacations in the icy region of Zibotria without informing anyone in advance. Similar rumors maintain that the modern version of Buddhism may have become corrupted to some extent over the centuries, to the point that the original version may indeed have been more consistent with a supposed disturbing interpretation, but such claims are completely unevidenced. Other Western religions include Taoism, which is dedicated to the peaceful worship of a variety of nature-related deities, and a group known as the Thugs, who are dedicated to creating thug dolls and real people's likenesses, and thrusting knives and other sharp implements into them, using magic to make the real people suffer the effects of this themselves and die in excruciating agony, all to satisfy the bloodthirsty cravings of a sadistic, murderous, blue-skinned goddess who wants to destroy the entire world. The Thugs aren't very popular. They've been compared with the Arvichians of the East, who take offense at the comparison, insisting they would never play with dolls. Fortunately, the prohibitively high MP cost for the Thugs' doll magic tends to leave the victim with only minor abrasions, with very few people attaining to the MP and intelligent stats necessary to take it any further. On the topic of magic, it's strongly suspected by scholars that magic is fundamentally limitless in its potential, even capable of undercutting all known scientific principles and reshaping the whole universe in the right hands. It's speculated that the only limiting factor on people's ability to exploit this potential is their MP, intelligence, and wisdom stats, the boundaries of which prevent magic from being used to very great effect by just about anyone. These stats cannot be combined or transferred between people, hence the upper boundary on magic potential is whoever has the highest scores for these stats at any given time. Even worse, the only cost-effective way to restore the critical MP stat is to go to sleep for 8 hours, with all other MP restorative methods being extremely expensive and rare for some reason. As a result, most magicians can do little more than create very small fires, heal someone's wounds, and do other minor things, like those quickly running out of MP after only a few casts of these spells. Off the back of these controversial modern ideas about the magical and chaotic true nature of existence, the famous novelist Ernest Hemingway had started writing a story about the perceived fragility of science, called the science fiction. However, Ernest later lost his mind before he could finish it, dying under the mad paranoid delusion that Emperor Damaric had an elaborate network of spies monitoring him at all times on the suspicion of him being a closet Bestian sympathizer. Damaric has assured the public that Burke was off his rocker. Professor Breven V. Falconer, the undead zombie Bestian of Yalmagul, is a proud member of the Unmode movement. In spite of his strongly suspected hatred of what fellow Unmode academics would call unreason, Falconer is known as one of the very few prominent Unmode figures who courts non-religious and even non-scientific sensibilities, having supposedly remarked that reason without unreason doesn't have working legs, but unreason without reason can't see very well, and the captain does not batten down the hatches with the universe, except apparently he actually does, so never mind. Some self-proclaimed unreasonables and Mower show advocates, however, are skeptical of Falconer's supposed unreasoned sympathies, citing that voluminous myriads of unsourced quotes have been attributed to the man over the years that he can't remember saying, to the point that it's hard to tell which of them, if any, he has ever even said. The unreason-tolerant image that Falconer strives to project is met with contempt by Unmode advocates like Doc Bleatlam, who inveighed almightily against his rank idolatry when he graciously collected an honor from the Mower Show Society for his contributions to Mower Show apologism, and who also expressed similar disgust on finding out Falconer had skipped church several times in the past 50 years, saying of his attendance, "I must call that rare, sir." It also does seem somewhat at odds with things like Falconer's universally scornful attitude to suggestions that the captain might not exist, or that there is no good ship, which invariably meet with a brusquely dismissive rejection from the ghoulish professor. He's been known to pounce on new scientific developments, like the discovery of genetics and DNA as proof of manifestation evolution, and by extension the captain's existence, and the incontrovertible truthfulness of the entire manifest, to an extent that some feel is him trying to find the captain in the shortening of the gaps. Perhaps his most notorious behavior would be his historical boycotting of all scientific conferences held in the short-lived left-handed nation of Sinistria, which he insisted was done on logical and rational grounds, but which many suspect might have been secretly motivated by the contempt of left-handers that seems to be characteristic of the unmodern supporters of the concerebral politics they tend to favor, Professor Kinder's surmise, and his faction notwithstanding. His response to persistent criticism for his actions was to run the critics over with his enormous metal wheelchair, which he needs as a zombie. With regard to such concerns, and especially with regard to Professor Falconer's zombie status, some have questioned whether a rotting pile of undead flesh should continue to hold the academic position they enjoyed in life. Such objections have been met with scornful condemnation by the academic establishment of Yale, who insist Falconer worked very hard to earn his tenure 2 centuries ago, and that it would be anti-intellectual to take it away from him. The anti-left-hander tendencies of the unmode baffles some, but traditionally the left-handed have always been associated with a lack of sympathy for ideals like logic, reason, rationality, and the scientific project as a whole, finding them to be repressive and soulless constructs that they feel little to no identity with on pretty much any level, even as respect for and deference to these things is implicitly mandated in a captained world. Such connotations are arguably a contributing factor to the long-standing persecution of the left-handed, which ultimately culminated in the sinister genocide following the Wars of the Hands. The nation of Sinistria was formed several decades ago by the left-handed community to establish their own nation, as a last-ditch effort to escape the constant persecutions and threats of total annihilation they had struggled with for all of recorded history up to that point. The country quickly became notorious for its extremely militant and defensive nature, being perceived by the wider world to react with disproportionate retribution to all real and perceived threats to their sovereignty. Modern historians incline towards the view that these behaviors were exaggerated by Arvichian authorities as well as by Bestia's concerebral political agitators, claiming that similarly aggressive and heavy-handed military actions have been displayed on a constant basis by Arvich, and occasionally even by Bestia, with incidents such as the Great Walls Massacre and its incredibly dubious invasion and subsequent conquering of Persia. The East's Maguls are notorious for their rivalries, while the Maguls' venerable home systems ensure that tribal rivalry sentiments are artificially ingrained in all of the impressionable child students who attend these institutions and then go on to hold positions of great power and influence as adults. A spiritual inter-Magul equivalent of this home system is perceived to exist among the academic staff as well. For example, Bestia's Arrow and Heaton are constantly at each other's throats, as are Arvich's Coxford, Lamebridge, and Yull, each one of which seeing itself as the most preeminent Magul of their country. This reached a head at an inter-Magul gathering when Roni Adderson, the famous Weasley con artist who had attended Lamebridge himself, put it to wireless celebrity and anti-Mower show activist Levenstein that he had gone to one of the only 2 great Maguls between Coxford, Lamebridge, and Yull. Levin nodded in agreement, noting that Coxford is a complete dump, at which point the Harvard-educated Dr. Niles Palmer interjected that all the Arvich Maguls are complete dumps besides Harvard, only for Professor Catherine Dunkirk to chime in that Heaton makes all the other Maguls in the world look like complete dumps, which led Professor Doc Bleatlam to protest that Lamebridge is the only Magul that isn't a complete dump. After which Professor Breven Falconer said Yull is the, at which point his jaw literally dropped off of his zombie face, whereupon he picked it up and reattached it before continuing only Magul that isn't a complete dump. After which Professor D.C. Whiteley angrily exclaimed that Bursar Kelly is the only Magul that isn't a complete dump. After which Professor Noam Chewsgummy asserted that Arrow is the only Magul that isn't a complete dump. Suffice it to say, the entire event quickly degenerated into a farcical chest-thumping contest between all of the alumni and academics present, during which Adderson took the opportunity to steal all of the charity money for orphanages that the Inter-Magul Peace and Togetherness event had been set up to collect. Some have questioned whether the political, cultural, religious, dexterous, and general identitarian tensions that seem to increasingly plague the modern world could possibly have some connection with the heavily influential Maguls' tribal indoctrination of their similarly influential students under their homes. Such suggestions have predictably been met with complete disbelief by just about everybody in a position of power and authority in either Arvich or Bestia, except from King Benetram, aka King Bremner, and a small handful of others such prominent people. Among said small handful is Emperor Damaric, aka Premier Spons, who never went to Magul, and has agreed that them bloomin' magoola think they're so great with their stupid oozes and degrees and stuff. Although on being petitioned to reform the education system to do something about this, he has responded with the decisive argument, get stuffed. Some have questioned in kind whether the Magul's academics might be fanning the flames of tensions with their ignorant, self-righteous, and divisive political and cultural activism, which has again been dismissed by the institutions. However, this seems to have taken a turn, as Arrow recently had the audacity to strip liberative agitator Professor Doriath Storkey of his tenure and remove him from office following his incendiary and scathingly worded claim that the Zebrian damming doesn't satisfy the dictionary definition of a genocide, which it does, which itself came off the back of fellow Professor Naim Chewsgum's public refusal to recognize that the damming had ever even happened in the first place. Lord Baron Councillor Storkey has gone on to argue he's a plucky understork who has been muted by the establishment and has come out in solidarity with the Beverian Chewsgum's position that the damming was a false flag operation designed to make his cherished anarchist beaver movement look bad. Professor Stephanie Redmond is a relatively low-profile member of the Unmode movement who supports the essential tenets of the Unmode, but is generally perceived to be avoidant of the kind of direct, confrontational agitation that they're so well known for. With that said, Unmode sentiment bleeds through a lot of her writings and communications, particularly with her most recent Lehman-directed publication, A Critique of Pure Unreason, which has been described in unflattering terms as a diatribe demonstrating the usual talking points of Unmode agitators, including a fixation with the perceived dangers of what they call manifest illiteracy, which boils down to an ignorance of the scientific process and its accompanying body of knowledge, the notion that general society's critical thinking skills and rational faculties are on some kind of dangerous decline, a deep concern for the captaincy and the threats it supposedly faces from superstition, paganism, and idolatry, and, of course, a searing contempt for the Mower show and everything the Unmode perceive it to stand for. Redmond's book concluded by claiming that any kind of desirable progress will only be made in society if people throw off their tired old shackles of pure unreason and come to embrace manifest principles and develop their rational faculties, which she believes will prove to be the ultimate source of solutions to all of the world's problems, to be followed as a categorical imperative. She points to such scientific developments as Democritian particle splitters as a font of newcome hope for bold, revolutionary change to the human Indian condition, which will produce a fallout with our savage, hateful past. While her Unmode leanings are broadly unpopular, they are seen as fairly benign and civilly expressed compared to the activities of her Unmode academic colleagues. However, Redmond did face a lot of controversy following a public statement she made to the effect that she believes there is strong scientific evidence to support the idea that women are, on rational balance, inferior to men in a number of key regards, which she believes goes a long way to explaining why women are so underrepresented in positions of power and influence, as well as in academic disciplines such as her own. Notwithstanding the obvious irony that Stephanie herself is female, the professor has been accused of sexism and of prejudicing the political process. Stephanie has expressed confusion over the hostile reaction to her statements, clarifying that she was just stating the facts, as determined by peer-reviewed scientific research, and that taking issue with such a thing is the purview of unreasonables. She further added that it should be obvious she was not trying to suggest these alleged facts are to be taken as any kind of political mandate. However, the Orthodoxian movement and various other political interests seem to have disagreed with Redmond's assessment, given their immediate and relentless weaponization of the obscure body of research that Redmond brought into the limelight with her controversial statement, together with the highly respected Redmond's explicit endorsement of said research's conclusions. The Arvich Empire has since adopted a policy of culling women from important roles in corporate and academic settings, citing the research as precisely the mandate that Redmond protested it not to be, and batting away said protestations by saying, "We think the woman protests too much." Bestia's Liberative Party has started to push their politics in a similar direction, as has Dr. Niles Palmer's research subdivision in Buy Things From Our Company Corporation, CRTM. In spite of such developments, Redmond refuses to back down from her position, emphasizing the importance of standing strong against the forces of unreason in the face of their idolatrous iniquity, and generally making statements that to some seem increasingly indicative of the sorts of unmode sensibilities she had previously been keeping at arm's length. Tensions reached a fever pitch when a contingent of mode academics, political pundits, and wider cultural agitators pushed to have Redmond stripped of her tenure and fired from her job, which was countered by a contingent of unmode academics, political pundits, and wider cultural agitators who fought a bitter battle over the whole thing, while Redmond herself came across like a piggy in the middle of two opposing, venomous forces. In the end, Redmond kept her job and continues to advance her position on the probable inferiority of women as a scientific imperative, but in light of recent events, the general public are reportedly starting to see where her detractors might have been coming from all along. The Oxford anthropology professor Lionel Dennett is a highly polarizing academic. He made a name for himself invecting against the dragon world during the ill-fated period when human/eon society was making tentative efforts to build bridges with the dragons. While these attempts at peacemaking were rocky at the best of times, there's a common impression that Professor Dennett contributed to the ultimate breakdown of the whole project, with the very strong prevailing suspicion that his provocative words goaded dragon malcontents into actions that ultimately led to the infamous lava reef incident of 329-0. Dennett was defiant on the point of dragon reconciliation, insisting that no meaningful relations could be built with the savage and backward creatures unless they were disabused of their faith in the obviously false dragon gods as well as their absurd claims to draconic supremacy over all the world. Dennett was baffled at his fellow academics, who he insisted knew better, were humoring the dragons on aspects of their culture that anyone with two brain cells to rub together could tell were hateful, superstitious, and above all incompatible with Arvichian values. Some commentators questioned his spiritual presumptions as well as why on earth he should expect Arvichian values to apply to dragons at all. They also sensed a profound hypocrisy in his position, given the diplomatic efforts had only been rendered possible by the dragons refraining from imposing their own values on Arvichians, in spite of their religious doctrines compelling them to subjugate the entire world, whereas Dennett himself seemed to be advocating for some kind of imperial subjugation of dragonkind. In his defense, Dennett invoked the obvious superiority of Arvichian academic and intellectual sensibilities over the dragon's groundless and uncapped driveland, adding that if the glorious Arvich Empire had managed to colonize and forcibly subjugate the dragons centuries ago, they wouldn't be so hostile to us now, and we wouldn't be in this ridiculous situation in the first place. Dennett has always split opinion profoundly in the Eastern world, with many seeing him as a truth-telling hero who stuck it to the evil dragons like they deserved, and with many others regarding him as an arrogant and hateful bigot who looked down on the dragons as inferior and unworthy of respect in the face of his precious Arvichian empire, its culture, and its values. Opinion is similarly split on whether he really did incite what happened at Lava Reef, with some observers feeling that the whole thing had been a ticking time bomb from the start, given the dragons' ongoing draconian demands for tribute and the merciless burninations they committed when these weren't delivered. In any case, after the diplomacy ended, the dragons largely disappeared off the map, with dragon sightings of any kind being a rare thing to this very day. Much like with Dennett, this state of affairs has also split opinion. Some people feel relieved that the much despised dragons are finally gone, and that they no longer have to live in fear of the proud, hulking beasts. Others, however, find the abrupt disappearance and subsequent silence of the dragons deeply unnerving, leading them to wonder where they've gone, and why on earth they've withdrawn from wider society so completely. Some even have a horrible feeling that the dragons are merely biding their time before they return in full force to unleash some kind of monstrous retaliation that will make the burninations look like child's play. Pretty much the only dragon available for comment in modern times is the Holy Child's famous friend, Axtoneth. Those brave enough to approach the spiteful dragon about the fears of a forthcoming retaliation have reported that he growled between scornful snorts that he's not aware of any such plan, before he predictably told them to leave him be, as he always does to literally everyone other than the Holy Child, whoever tries to engage him in conversation. Many have questioned why some eons, such as horse eons, walk on all fours, like their animal equivalents, whereas others, such as Jones and Cations, stand upright like humans. It's believed that this is largely a product of cultural convention, as well as successive generations of breeding for these sorts of traits, which is a practice believed to date back to the time of the unicorns, and even beyond. Many eons have reported an instinctive impulse to stand and behave like their spirit animal, but also feel a deep pressure to carry themselves as much like humans as possible in polite society, to such an extent that it intrudes even on their private lives. In bygone times, when eons were largely enslaved to human masters, the so-called housebreaking of eons, which was a bid to make them behave more like humans, was a common thing. Jones' forelegs, for example, were actively crippled so as to make them unwalkable, forcing them to stand on their back legs. Horse-ones and ponions were placed in harnesses that forced their naturally sloping necks to be more upright and erect, which was reportedly extremely painful for them. This latter practice was controversial even in its own time, as highlighted by the publication of a famous propaganda tract from over a century ago, White Wonder, which they inexplicably turned into what has become a popular children's story in more modern times in spite of its aggressively political intent. This last development is especially ironic since the still active organization that published White Wonder, Humans, for the ethical treatment of eones, was viewed as somewhat extreme in their actions on behalf of eon rights. They entered onto the political stage in 2050 after firebombing an eon conditioning center, killing over 5 humans and 40 eons in the process, and persisting with a series of violent actions that they finally stopped after eons complained that their anti-human actions were killing far more eons than humans, although it's suspected they only really stopped because the firebombings weren't getting them as much attention anymore. From this point they moved on to less violent actions, like demonstrations and the dissemination of propaganda pamphlets. Throughout all of this they were popularly perceived to exhibit the same hyper-aggressive, self-righteous, and ugly tendencies that had seemingly led to their original firebombing campaigns. They're particularly notorious for their targeting of children with extremely violent and unfamily-friendly media, such as with the aforementioned White Wonder storybook adaptation, which contains extremely graphic depictions of mutilated eon carcasses at the hands of cartoonishly villainous humans, who are explicitly identified with the impressionable target audience's own parents. In the last decade, HETE partnered with LGN Corporation, getting them to produce a series of child-focused game sets that continues this trend, taking popular game set characters like Mario, Cooking Mama, and Ash Ketchum, and portraying them as eon-abusing monsters who strap eons to racks, skin them alive, and commit all manner of other horrifying abominations on their thrashing, screaming bodies. Many have called out HETE for their deeply unethical and irresponsible behavior such as the above. Some also suspect them of disingenuousness, with their ridiculous and over-the-top actions being deliberately designed purely to garner attention through the shock and outrage they inevitably cause. As a consequence, their supposedly child-facing media is suspected to not actually be intended for child consumption at all, only being used as a tool to attract as much fraudulent attention to themselves and their political causes as possible. Other recent actions of the organization include the blockading of roads and chariot races, the hijacking of popular sports events, and the waging of a bitter legal campaign to sue a human who took a photograph of a dog on the grounds that the dog should have the rights to the photo since its descendants might one day evolve into Jones. In spite of the popular objections to basically everything HETE ever does, they inexplicably receive a lot of traction, with celebrity endorsements and mainstream media coverage pouring into this day. HETE respond to the criticism by highlighting the fundamentally non-violent and peaceful nature of their actions, although many sense that the original firebomb-throwing soul of the organization has never truly left them, merely manifesting itself now through vaguely less morally bankrupt means in service of the same presumptuous and self-aggrandizing ends. The supermine is where the excavations started to get very juicy indeed. The stuff coming out of those is classified, only government higher-ups have clearance to find out about those. But we can bypass that, can't we? The supermine contained many objects there, where the photogrammations came from, as well as some of the fossils that have started to give serious corroboration to truth claims in the manifest that had to be taken on faith for centuries. So many objects to collect. The miners got the sense that if they could just find all of them, something very good would happen, as if it was something they were supposed to do. Unfortunately, just when things were getting even juicier, and they were successfully retrieving many of the remaining objects, the excavations were abruptly cut short when an unidentified aerial object moved beyond the far side of the head miner's vision. In his later testimony, elicited as he lay dying in a hospital bed from banyan poisoning, it was at this point that reality itself seemed like it was breaking down, and a message appeared in his mind that said buffer overflow exception. Jet set execute the remaining objects in the mine, then all disappeared, leaving the whole place empty. Its contents vanished without a trace, and it became impossible to complete the mission. Later on, another team was sent down there, which discovered the objects had all returned, only for the same scenario to play out with them. The supermine is closed for now, until the researchers can figure out a way to deal with this curious problem. Some of them have wondered how on earth whoever built this mine in ancient times managed to leave such an obvious and critical issue unchecked before opening the facility to the public, and they do believe it was open to all, judging by the many skeletons discovered therein. In the far reaches of space, the space blasters fight off an alien invasion en route to try and get to the fabled Mower show, and wish for a true peace in space. But suddenly a distress signal comes in. Buck Bodgers the space rabbit tries to answer it, and puts the caller up on the monitor, but spends so long doing his over-elaborate saluting ritual that the crew loses the signal before finding out what's wrong. His space cat girlfriend Catherine Kachansky then accidentally spills the vindaloo curry she was eating all over the space radio, and breaks it completely. Meow, I've done it. You certainly have, you incompetent fool. That curry was 3 minutes past its expiry time, which is in strict contravention of Space Protocol 5 subsection 33 paragraph 4 sentence, go mule over it, you rule freak. At least it wasn't alphabeti spaghetti this time. I told you before not to bring up your stupid alphabeti spaghetti again. You still reeked of the stuff for days after you washed it all off. Well, you should have told me you weren't into thup. Now we shall have to call the mechanic to fix the space radio. I shall do so now. No, you won't. I'll do it. If you go, you'll spend 5 minutes saluting him before you even tell him what's wrong. Don't be ridiculous. Space protocol is for salutes to last no more than 3 minutes and 54 seconds. I don't believe you. Why are you even my boyfriend? I ask myself the same question. But you don't have a boyfriend? Oh, very funny. What are you talking about? I wasn't joking. Of course you were. Everyone knows same-sex relations are expressly forbidden by Space Protocol 3 subsection 7 paragraph 14 sentence 2. I'm not talking about the stupid space proto. Furthermore, I already have a girlfriend, and having more than one romantic partner is also expressly forbidden by Space Protocol 3 subs. Shouldn't we go get Roddy? PH 5 sentence 4, which was introduced in space year 3.88143598 billion following an unfortunate incident with a slightly morose space anglerfish. I'll go get him, meow. The space anglerfish became jealous of her boyfriend's other girlfriend, and sabotaged the controls on her space buggy, which led to, where did you go? And what in space are you doing here, Toastsworth? What? That's the 51st time you've asked me today. And asking the same question more than 50 times a day is in direct violation of Space Proto. In spite of the state's efforts, word is getting out around the Empire about the Mower show being scheduled. People of all ages are rallying in droves to try and make their way to Bestia, fully aware of the fate that almost certainly awaits them for trying to do so. But they have to try. And maybe, just maybe, together they can defy that fate